A bid for statehood at the UN sets member countries on a collision course. Why are the Palestinians insisting on full recognition? And why is the US determined to block it? How does this affect the Middle East peace process? And can the US remain an honest broker? This is Inside Story. Hello there, a warm welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. So the UN has become a diplomatic battleground. Mahmoud Abbas says he will submit his bid for the United Nations recognition of a Palestinian state on Friday. The US says it will veto it. And the French President Nicolas Sarkozy says that could spark another cycle of violence in the region. From New York, Mike Hanna has the details.
Israeli opposition to Palestinian statehood expressed outside as well as inside the United Nations. Addressing this crowd, the Deputy Speaker of Israel's parliament, who says Israel should annex West Bank settlements in retaliation for the Palestinian move.
The Palestinians will go ahead unilaterally. We must unilaterally take action as well. And I will recommend the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to annex the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. This is not the way to negotiate.
And in the sheltered confines of the United Nations, the argument was less loud but no less intense. And during the day, talk of division among Palestinian delegates as to whether or not to go to the United Nations Security Council first rather than the General Assembly to seek membership. And a meeting between the US President and the Israeli Prime Minister, an opportunity to share opposition to either of the Palestinian options. Earlier, Barack Obama offered little new in his address to the General Assembly, insisting there were no shortcuts to a Middle East settlement, but not suggesting any new ways to break the long-standing deadlock. Enter the French president, who had ideas in abundance, suggesting the Palestinians should be given non-member status by the General Assembly rather than seek full membership in the Security Council, and outlining an accelerated timeline for negotiations.
Let us move forward. Let us move out of the fatal trap of paralysis, missed appointments and failed attempts to relaunch the process. Let us change our method, and let us change our state of mind.
The suggestions were described by the Palestinians as interesting, but it was made clear that seeking non-membership status in the General Assembly would only be considered after the request for full membership was heard in the Security Council.
We will give it a real try. We're not bluffing. We'll really give it a real try. And if we fail, we'll keep knocking at the door of the Security Council later. But when do we go to the General Assembly is a decision that has not been made yet. Most likely we will, but when is a decision that has not been made yet.
But you will not go before the Security Council. It's been submitted to Security Council, is that correct?
We will not go before the Security Council had a real chance to consider it.
An evening meeting between President Obama and his Palestinian counterpart produced no shift in the Palestinian position and no flexibility in the US stance that at this stage it would veto any Palestinian move in the Security Council. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, New York.
Well, to further discuss the Palestinians' case for statehood, we're joined today by Mustafa Barghouti in Ramallah, head of the Palestinian National Initiative, and in Madrid, Shlomo Ben Ami, former Israeli foreign minister, now vice president of the Toledo International Center for Peace. And in Los Angeles, Josh Lockerman, a lecturer in law at the University of Southern California, as well as an expert in US foreign policy. Thank you all, gentlemen, for being with us today. If I could start with you, Mustafa Barghouti, why is Abbas pursuing this vote now when he knows full well that it's going to put him on a direct collision course with the US?
For the very simple reason that after 20 years of useless negotiations, we found ourselves witnessing the continuous annexation of Palestinian land and the creation of a system of apartheid. And the negotiations and status quo are used by Israel as a cover for the expansionist policy of Netanyahu and the settlers. And these talks, the peace process itself, has become a substitute to peace and a cover for the Israeli apartheid creation. So we have to resist that. And I think the act in the United Nations is only one part of bigger resistance. You can call it diplomatic resistance. It's an outcry to the international community at the same time, telling them that we are at the very, very important crossing point where any more delay with this continuation of settlement expansion, the whole idea and principle of peace based on two-state solution could die.
So he is right
and
to
the very last
right
opportunity of creation of a Palestinian state could vanish.
He is right to pursue this
Absolutely,
at the UN.
Of course. Absolutely. Not only that, but I hope this will become part of a bigger and larger strategy that to change the balance of power on the ground, to make the cost of occupation bigger than its benefits, to enhance popular non-violent Palestinian struggle and resistance, and to enhance international pressure on the Israeli government to end this path.
Okay, Shlomo Ben Ami, if I could turn to you, why is Israel so against this bid at the UN?
Well, because the Israeli position is still within the framework of the Oslo process, which is built on direct incremental negotiations for a two-state solution. What one can see is that there is a shift in the strategy of the Palestinians, which the Israelis are not very happy about. And this shift means that they are looking for a change of paradigm, no longer bilateral talks, but tipping the balance of power that in the Oslo process was built on unequal partnership between Israel and the Palestinians by mobilizing the reservoir of international support that the Palestinians have in international agencies, first and foremost the UN, and this is something that Israel doesn't like because the UN, as it were, was in recent years the home ground of the Palestinians. So that's the reason that the Israelis are against it. They still would like to stick to the Oslo process. But
you can understand, can't you? You can understand Abbas's frustration after 20 years of talks and no progress.
Well, it's not true to say no progress at all. I mean, we had governments that negotiated in good faith with the Palestinians, and were two of them at least were very close to reaching an agreement. And what you see today, that people are talking in Israel of 67 as a possibility for a solution, for a territorial solution, and not discarding, I mean, the bulk of Israeli society does not discard the division of Jerusalem. All this is a result of our two governments, the Olmert government and Barak government, that broke those taboos. That was not enough from the viewpoint of the Palestinians, and when the government of Netanyahu came to office, they saw no point in negotiating given the structure, the ideological and political structure of this government, they saw no point and went for a change of paradigm.
Judge Lockman, what can the Palestinians gain from this move, if anything?
Well, I think this comes down to political brinksmanship and possibly the disastrous consequences on the ground that could come the day after a vote at the UN, whether at the Security Council or the General Assembly. That's why we've seen President Obama come out so strongly against this bid for statehood at the UN, primarily because it detracts from the kind of central American role for mediation for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And as Foreign Minister Ben-Ami mentioned, the Oslo process itself, which was started in 1993. Over the last 3 decades, we've seen successful U.S. mediation in the region, starting obviously with the 1979 Camp David Accords and the starting of negotiations in Madrid and then in Oslo in 1993. And I think this bid itself could end up producing disastrous consequences on the ground, possibly even a third intifada, which the Americans, the Europeans, and clearly the Israelis do not want to see happen.
Indeed. OK, well, let's take a look now at of what the US position is here. We've got a few clips which show how President Barack Obama appears to have changed his stance towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since taking office back in January 2009. Let's take a listen.
The United States does not accept the legitimacy of continued Israeli settlements. This construction violates previous agreements and undermines efforts to achieve peace. It is time for these settlements to stop. We believe the borders of Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed swaps. Israelis and Palestinians will negotiate a border that is different than the one that existed on June 4th, 1967. When we come back here next year, we can have an agreement that will lead to a new member of the United Nations, an independent, sovereign state of Palestine living in peace with Israel. I am convinced that there is no shortcut to the end of a conflict that has endured for decades. Peace is hard work. Peace will not come through statements and resolutions at the United Nations. If it were that easy, it would have been accomplished by now.
Josh Lockman, just a year ago there, we saw Obama alluding to 2011 this year as being the year that would see a Palestinian state joining the UN. So what's changed?
What's changed is obviously, I think, the Arab Spring. We saw President Obama give a very strong speech in May this year, reacting to the events of the Arab Spring, primarily, obviously, what we've seen taking place in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Bahrain. And he also paid note to the continuing exacerbation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But he said publicly what many Americans have said privately to the Israelis and Palestinians over the last 2 decades, which is that the final settlement and deal between Israel and the Palestinians will involve the pre-1967 borderlines, with mutually agreed upon land swaps. And I think that's where the deal goes forward. I think in the wake of this showdown at the UN, we will see renewed negotiations on a concrete timetable that work toward really bridging the divide between the Israelis and Palestinians. And as Foreign Minister Ben-Ami mentioned, we've seen twice in 2000 at Camp David and in 2008 between President Abbas and Prime Minister Olmert, the sides come so close to a deal, and I think that's where we pick up from, and that's where the Americans come in and try to mediate and resume direct negotiations.
Okay, Mustafa Barghouti, do you agree with that? Will we see renewed negotiations? Is America still the key mediator here?
No, it's not, because Mr. Obama broke. The Israeli pressure changed him, and he changed his positions. Actually, his speech now in the United Nations is like he is speaking against himself. He has promised to stop the settlements. Now he doesn't even mention them. He spoke about 67 borders. That does not find a place in his speech. He wants us to go back to the same negotiations without freezing settlements and without any clear framework. So practically what changed is not the Arab Spring. Unfortunately, Obama's position has changed despite the Arab Spring. And his speech was full of hypocrisy, double standard, the same principles that he is trying to apply to the Arab Spring of freedom, self-determination, etc. He's not applying to the Palestinians. On the contrary, he is proud of the fact that the Egyptians managed to change a regime in 18 days, and now he blames us for wanting to have a change after 20 years, and every year has 365 days in it. I think Mr. Obama is contradicting himself, and because he has become biased to the Israeli position, I think he has harmed drastically the ability of the United States to be a mediator in this conflict.
I want to throw this over to Mr. Shlomo Ben-Ami. I mean, it's true, isn't it? There is a sense of hypocrisy that's coming out of the White House here. You, as a former foreign minister, have been privy to the workings in the White House. Interested to get an idea from you, who's pushing the administration to support the Israeli agenda?
Well, I think that's not a secret. Kissinger once unfairly criticized Israel for only having a domestic policy, not a foreign policy. Well, the same can be said of many countries in the West, and in this particular case, of course, of the United States. I think there is no doubt that President Obama is now witnessing the agony of power and the constraints that the domestic constraints that forced him to change his rhetoric, to change his messages to the region. If you add to this the objective decline in American power in the Middle East in the wake of the Iraq, Afghanistan experience, and the hesitant attitude towards the Arab Spring, one could argue, as Mustafa Barghouti is saying, that America is losing its capacity to be an honest broker in the eyes of the Arab side and of the Palestinians. Nonetheless, it is extremely difficult, even impossible, to imagine an alternative third power or a third mediator. You cannot think, for example, of the Europeans, given the deep divisions, the economic weaknesses, the inward-looking processes that you see right now in Europe. Europe will be an inefficient, at least as America, perhaps for different reasons, mediator. So America remains, in my view, still the indispensable nation when it comes to trying to put international alliances, maybe not monopolize as it did in the past, but yes, create international coalitions in order to push forward the peace process in the Middle East. This is the only country that has the necessary leverage, if it wants to use it, on Israel. And you need leverage. You need a cocktail of incentives and pressures.
But surely it is showing its bias towards Israel. This block, this veto of the Palestinians' bid does not allow the two sides to negotiate on equal terms.
Well, that's true. I mean, I did agree with Mustafa on this point, that seemingly the American position tips on the side of the Israelis and might even unleash the rage of demonstrators, not only in Ramallah, but perhaps even throughout the Arab world. But again, rationally speaking, who else can mediate here? Does anybody really seriously believe that Europe, given its current condition, or Russia, or China, or what have you, I mean, it is America, and therefore I hope that once the president becomes his domestic problems, he might be a more efficient mediator than we saw so far, and perhaps we will see sooner or later, I hope sooner, a change in the coalition in Israel, a change in government. You see, the objective of American policy, not necessarily declared objective, needs to be to create a process that will force a change of the political map in Israel, because admittedly with the current coalition it is practically impossible to square the circle between the structure of the coalition and the necessities of the peace process.
Okay, Mr. Barghouti, who else could mediate if not the US?
Well, before they mediate, we need to have the framework of negotiations. I personally believe that at this very moment, there can be no successful negotiations because the balance of power is so much skewed in the interest of Israel. We need to change the paradigm. We need to change the balance of power on the ground. And that can happen through, first of all, popular nonviolent resistance on the Palestinian side. I insist nonviolent, and we insist on nonviolence. Besides, a strong international solidarity, including boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel till it ends its apartheid. And finally, bring back Palestinian unity to strengthen our ranks. I think once there are better conditions for negotiations, then we can look for a mediator. At this very moment, with this Israeli government, which is a government of settlers and extreme right-wingers, with people like Lieberman as a foreign minister of Israel, there is no hope for any negotiations, even if the Americans improve their positions. The situation here is a situation where you need to change the paradigm, the balance of power. Any student in political science understands that the outcome of negotiations depends on the balance of power. That's why I hope that our move in the UN is just the beginning of a new strategy, a unified strategy, a strategy to change the balance of power rather than continuing to play the same game that Israel wants. You see, one element here that is not mentioned always, usually, is the element of time. I really worry because, and I think every Israeli should worry as well, because with the passage of time, the very last opportunity of two-state solution will vanish. Then even with the best mediators in the world, you cannot have a state. It will be full of settlers. And then the only outcome would be one-state solution. So in my opinion today, the world must understand either two-state solution, and then they should support our bid and our demand for recognition of independence, or then we will have to struggle for one-state solution with equal rights for everybody. It is the situation today. It's like that. And nobody should blame us for the fact that Israel is killing the two-states option and for the fact that the United States is being complicit with this policy.
Okay.
And many people in the international community are silent about it.
Okay, Josh Lockman, the Palestinians really don't have any alternative at this stage other than to go at it unilaterally, do they?
No, I actually think they do. I have to respectfully disagree with Mr. Barghouti. I think there is a Central American role in mediating and resolving not only the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but improving impaired relations between Israel and two of its key allies, Turkey and Egypt. This is where the United States can help diffuse what was becoming a diplomatic and political crisis for Israel in the wake of the Palmer Commission at the UN, in which Israel was largely vindicated in the Gaza flotilla raid, the Mavi Marmara raid of 2010. And we've seen tensions between Turkey and Israel and Egypt and Israel rise. I think the American role here is to ensure that negotiations move forward in the wake of a vote or even a tabling of a vote at the UN over the next few weeks or months. And I think we definitely need more involvement from Saudi Arabia and Jordan, which are also key U.S. allies that have a role to play in the financial and kind of oversight of any negotiations in trying to find an honest broker, obviously, between Israel and the Palestinians.
Okay, Mr. Shlomo Ben Ami, first of all, Saudi involvement, is that an option? Secondly, Israel is in a precarious position, isn't it? It should be concerned about being isolated in the region right now.
Well, yes. Well, I doubt as to the Saudi willingness to engage. You know, since the Saudi peace initiative of 2002, we haven't seen much of a movement. They are looking for signals from the Israeli side, signals from the US, and these signals, are, as far as they are concerned, are not encouraging enough. So I don't see that happening. As to Israel's international isolation, well, yes, indeed. I'm more concerned about Israel's regional isolation. I think that the Arab Spring has changed the strategic structure of the region in a way that turns Egypt into a much more tense neighbor. I mean, foreign policy is now, in a way, not truly dictated, but yes, influenced, greatly influenced by the masses that do not find yet satisfaction in the transition to democracy, and it is not very difficult to divert them through a sort of diverted mobilization. This is what we saw in the assault on the Israeli embassy. And then you have Turkey.
I'm going to jump in here, Mr. Ben Ami. Apologies, but we've only got a couple of minutes left, and there is one point I want to put to all three of you. If you could just have like a matter of seconds to address your heads of state, to advise them on this issue, what would you tell them to do now? Mr. Barghouti, what would you tell Mahmoud Abbas?
I will tell him, please proceed with your bed. Don't listen to these pressures, and continue and come back and try to help establish very strong Palestinian unity. And if they don't allow us to get the recognition in the Security Council, let's go to the General Assembly and have a decision there, a resolution. Asking the Security Council to accept our full membership and not partial membership. We have a long way, but we have a sure way to freedom.
What would you tell President Obama?
I would advise President Obama to send a high-level delegation or envoy to the region. We've seen, David Hale and Dennis Ross from the White House come to the region and meet with the Israelis and Palestinians. But we need a high-level envoy. I mean, something, in the form perhaps of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, to meet with the Israelis and Palestinians and put a ton of energy and capital into resuming meaningful, substantive, and direct negotiations between the two sides as soon as possible. And
Mr. Ben Ami, what would you tell Benjamin Netanyahu?
Assume the inevitable and address Obama's speech where he spoke about 1967 with swaps and the two-state solution as the platform for renewing the negotiations. That's the only way that can fill the very dangerous void that will be created on the morrow of the UN vote.
Okay, very interesting to see if any of that advice will be heeded. Gentlemen, thank you all very much for joining us here for a very interesting discussion today. Mustafa Barghouti in Ramallah, Shmono Ben Ami in Madrid, and Josh Lockerman in Los Angeles. And thanks to you too for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Do email any comments and suggestions to insidestory@aljazeera.net. See you again soon.